6 months ago. The rejection email landed like a punch at 3:47 p.m. on a mundane Tuesday, buried between spam and grocery store promotions. Zara Johnson stared at her laptop screen, reading the same 4 sentences for the third time. Her Harvard PhD in computer science crumbled to worthless paper in her hands. Dear Ms. Johnson, thank you for your interest in the senior AI developer position at Technova. While your technical qualifications are impressive, we don't believe you'd be a good cultural fit for our dynamic team environment. We wish you success in your future endeavors. Best regards, David Morrison, CEO, Cultural Fit. Those 2 words seared through her soul like molten steel. She'd seen David Morrison speak at conferences, watched him preach about innovation and disruption, while his company's leadership page showcased 23 white faces and 2 token minorities. Cultural fit meant looking like them, talking like them, belonging to their exclusive boys' club. Zara closed the laptop with enough force to rattle her coffee cup. Her cramped Brooklyn apartment walls began closing in, suffocating her dreams. The walls pressed in with the weight of another closed door. Stanford had rejected her undergraduate application. MIT had waitlisted her for graduate school. She'd fought her way to Harvard, clawed her way to the top of her class, published papers that made tenured professors jealous. None of it mattered if she couldn't crack their fortress of privilege. The worst part? She needed this job desperately. Her savings were evaporating faster than her confidence, and her mother's medical bills wouldn't pay themselves. Pride was a luxury that her empty bank account had already foreclosed. Present day, the Sterling Restaurant, Manhattan. Table 7 is getting impatient, James whispered as he brushed past Zara with a tray of champagne flutes. VIP treatment, remember? Zara adjusted her black uniform and grabbed the wine bottle, its label reading like her monthly rent. The Sterling fed Manhattan's predatory elite, the kind of people who spent more on dinner than most families earned in a month. She'd been working here for 4 months, invisible to customers who saw only the uniform, never the person wearing it. The irony wasn't lost on her. By day, she coded revolutionary AI algorithms in her apartment. By night, she served blood-rare steaks to the very vultures who devoured her dreams. But invisibility had its advantages. Rich people said remarkable things when they thought nobody important was listening. Table 7 occupied the restaurant's prime real estate, a corner booth with city views and enough privacy for sensitive conversations. 3 men in $1,000 suits leaned over contracts and tablets, their voices low but urgent. Zara had served them twice before. Technology executives, judging by their jargon-heavy discussions about market penetration and disruption metrics. She approached with practiced invisibility, the kind service workers perfected to navigate wealthy spaces without causing offense. Good evening, gentlemen. Are we ready for wine service? The man facing her looked up, and Zara's world tilted sideways, her blood crystallizing to Arctic shards. David Morrison, CEO of Technova. The man who deemed her culturally unfit sat 3 feet away, completely unaware he was being served by the candidate he'd rejected 6 months ago. Time slowed to a crawl. David's eyes swept past her like she was invisible wallpaper in his gilded world. No recognition flickered in his expression. She was just another faceless server in his privileged world. The Bordeaux, David said, returning to his conversation without a second glance. Make sure it's properly aerated. Zara's hands remained steady as she uncorked the wine, muscle memory taking over while her mind raced. This was impossible. This was perfect. This was dangerous. As I was saying, David continued to his companions, the AI market is exploding, but we're hemorrhaging talent to Google and Microsoft. We need something revolutionary, something that'll put us back on the map. The man to his left, Marcus Chen, according to the reservation, nodded grimly. Our current systems are already outdated. We're burning through venture capital with nothing to show for it. Zara poured wine with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, but every syllable branded itself into her consciousness. She knew exactly what they needed. Her algorithms could solve their problems in weeks, not years. But they'd never know, because she didn't fit their cultural mold. What about external acquisition? Asked the third man, Sarah Williams, venture capitalist and Technova board member. Buy the talent we can't recruit? David swirled his wine thoughtfully. We're exploring options. There's some interesting independent work floating around, but most of it comes from unconventional sources. Academic types, freelancers, people whose Harvard PhDs were dismissed like grocery store coupons. People like her, Zara realized. People whose Harvard PhDs meant nothing if they didn't come wrapped in the right package. She finished pouring and stepped back, professionally invisible. Will there be anything else this evening? Actually, yes, David said, still not looking at her directly. We're expecting more guests. Can you ensure we're not interrupted? This is a sensitive business discussion. Of course, sir. Zara retreated to her station, mind spinning with possibilities and dangers. She could slink away defeated or stay and weaponize their arrogance against them. Revenge chose her instead. 20 minutes later, 2 more executives joined the table. Zara recognized them from tech news coverage. High-level engineers from competing firms. The kind of people who jump between companies for signing bonuses that exceeded her annual income. Gentlemen, ladies, David addressed the expanded group, what we're discussing tonight stays in this room. Technova is at a crossroads. We either find breakthrough technology in the next quarter, or we start considering merger offers from Microsoft. The implications hit Zara like a physical blow. Technova wasn't just struggling, they were dying. The same company that had rejected her was hemorrhaging money while she sat on solutions they desperately needed. There's one possibility, Marcus said carefully. We've identified some promising independent research, cutting-edge AI work that could revolutionize natural language processing. The algorithms are brilliant, potentially worth hundreds of millions. Sarah leaned forward. What's the catch? The researcher is difficult to locate. We only have fragments of their work published under pseudonyms, but what we've seen is remarkable. If we could acquire this technology. David's expression hardened with familiar ruthlessness. Then we acquire it. Legal concerns? That's where it gets complicated, Marcus replied. The work appears to be original, but proving ownership might be challenging. The researcher seems to value anonymity over profit. What followed was a masterclass in corporate espionage disguised as business strategy. They discussed reverse engineering techniques, patent applications for derivative works, and legal frameworks for acquiring intellectual property of questionable origin. Zara listened in growing horror as they planned to dissect her soul and sell the pieces for profit. Could they be talking about her algorithms? The papers she'd published under pseudonyms to protect herself from exactly this kind of theft? Here's what we do, David decided. We acquire whatever samples we can find, reverse engineer the core concepts, and file our own patents. By the time anyone objects, we'll have legal ownership of the derivative work. Their casual criminality hit her like a physical blow to the chest. These weren't just ruthless businessmen. They were thieves, planning to steal her life's work and claim credit for innovations they could never have created themselves. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd planned their heist in front of the very person they intended to rob. Zara excused herself to the kitchen, hands shaking with rage and adrenaline. She needed evidence, she needed proof, and she needed a plan that would expose their scheme without destroying her own carefully constructed anonymity. The restaurant's employee break room was deserted, staff busy with the dinner rush. Zara pulled out her phone and opened the voice recording app. Her journalism minor from Harvard had taught her about documentation and evidence. Tonight, those lessons would prove invaluable. She returned to table 7 with practiced calm, refilling water glasses and emptying ashtrays while the conspirators detailed their theft. Every word was captured, every admission preserved. They spoke freely around her, protected by their own prejudices and assumptions about who mattered and who didn't. The key is speed, David emphasized. We file patents first, establish legal precedents, then worry about challenges later. By the time any independent researcher surfaces, we'll own the technology legally. Marcus nodded. I can have our legal team start preliminary filings tomorrow. We'll need clean room documentation to prove independent development. Money talks louder than ethics in patent court, Sarah added cynically. Whoever has the better lawyers wins, regardless of who did the actual innovation. Zara's grip tightened on her water pitcher. They weren't just stealing her work, they were perverting the entire system designed to protect innovators like her. But their arrogance would be their downfall. They'd confess their crimes to the one person who could expose them completely. The evening stretched on with increasingly damning revelations. They discussed bribery disguised as consulting fees, industrial espionage masked as competitive research, and patent manipulation that bordered on fraud. Each admission was recorded, each crime documented with crystal clarity. By closing time, Zara had enough evidence to destroy Technova and send its leadership to federal prison. But destruction wasn't her goal. Justice was more complex than revenge, and she had a better plan brewing. As the conspirators prepared to leave, David caught her attention one final time. Excellent service tonight, very discreet, if only he knew how discreet she'd actually been. Zara smiled with perfect professional courtesy. Thank you, sir. I hope you found everything satisfactory. More than satisfactory. We'll definitely be back. They would indeed, though not in circumstances they could imagine. As the restaurant emptied and Zara finished her closing duties, her mind raced with possibilities. She had evidence of corporate espionage, patent fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. But more importantly, she had something they desperately needed and didn't know existed: the complete source code for the algorithms they planned to steal. She also had something else they'd never suspect: a Harvard PhD, a brilliant mind, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The game was about to change completely. Walking home through Manhattan's glittering streets, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since receiving that rejection email 6 months ago. Power. They'd underestimated her because of their prejudices, dismissed her because she didn't fit their narrow definition of valuable. But ghosts in their machine saw every dirty secret, and underestimated people had nothing to lose by fighting back. David Morrison and Technova had no idea they'd just declared war on someone far more dangerous than they could imagine. Someone who knew their secrets, understood their weaknesses, and had both the skills and motivation to destroy everything they'd built. But destruction was too simple, too crude. Zara had a much more elegant solution in mind. She was going to give them exactly what they wanted, and make them pay dearly for the privilege. Justice wasn't always swift, but when served by someone with nothing left to lose, it could be absolutely devastating. Tomorrow, she would teach them the true price of underestimating a Harvard PhD with nothing left to lose. Dawn broke over Manhattan like a blade, sharp, cold, and cutting through the lies that had protected David Morrison's world. Zara sat in her Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by 3 monitors displaying code that could revolutionize artificial intelligence. The irony wasn't lost on her. She lived like a pauper while sitting on a digital gold mine that could buy Manhattan itself. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. Morrison's assistant called. "Private party tonight, table 7 again. Requested you specifically for service. Perfect." They'd taken the bait. Zara sharpened her weapons of justice with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing for open-heart surgery on a dying company. She reviewed every recording from the previous evening, transcribing key quotes and timestamps. Her laptop contained backups of her research, patent applications she'd never filed, and documentation proving her authorship of the algorithms Technova planned to steal. But evidence was just ammunition. She needed to aim for the heart. David Morrison's biography was a masterclass in how privilege masquerades as genius. Born to wealth, educated at exclusive institutions, his family's donations had helped build. Fast-track through positions his connections had secured. His innovation credentials were thin, mostly acquisitions of other people's work, repackaged as visionary leadership. Marcus Chen was different, brilliant, self-made, genuinely talented. He'd built Technova's core infrastructure from scratch, earned his position through skill rather than connections. But brilliance without ethics was just sophisticated criminality, and last night had proven Marcus was willing to cross any line for corporate success. Sarah Williams was old money desperately clawing for relevance in a digital world that threatened to make her obsolete. Her venture capital firm specialized in acquiring promising technology from desperate founders, then squeezing out the original creators once the deals were signed. She'd built an empire on legal theft disguised as investment strategy. Together, they formed a trinity of everything wrong with Silicon Valley: hereditary privilege, corrupted talent, and predatory capitalism. They dismissed Zara because she didn't belong to their exclusive club, never imagining that exclusion could create an enemy far more dangerous than any competitor. The Sterling restaurant buzzed with its usual evening energy as Zara arrived for her shift. James briefed her on the evening's arrangements. Morrison's party had reserved the entire back section, with explicit instructions for privacy and discretion. They'd requested their favorite invisible servant, convinced she was too stupid to understand their billion-dollar conspiracy. "They've ordered our most expensive wine menu," James mentioned casually. "Whatever business they're conducting, money isn't an object." If only he knew they were planning to steal enough intellectual property to fund a small country. Zara spent the early evenings serving other tables, but her attention remained focused on the back section where Technova's conspirators were gathering. Tonight's guest list had expanded. She recognized faces from tech journalism coverage, including several patent attorneys and at least one federal regulatory official. This wasn't just corporate espionage anymore. This was a cancer metastasizing through the entire system. At 8:30, David Morrison arrived with an entourage that screamed power and influence. He'd brought Technova's entire executive team, 3 board members, and enough legal firepower to intimidate small nations. They thought they were meeting to plan the perfect crime. Instead, they were about to encounter the perfect trap. "Good evening," Zara said as she approached their table, voice perfectly calibrated for professional invisibility. "I'll be your server tonight." David's eyes swept over her like she was part of the furniture he owned. "Excellent. We'll need complete privacy this evening. No interruptions, no matter what you might overhear. The arrogance was breathtaking. They were literally inviting her to witness their conspiracy. Of course, sir. Your conversation will remain completely confidential. More than they could possibly imagine. The meeting began with standard corporate theater. Quarterly reports, market analysis, competitive positioning. But as wine flowed and perceived security increased, the real agenda emerged. Gentlemen, ladies, David addressed the group. What we're discussing tonight represents Technova's future. We've identified revolutionary AI technology that could dominate the market for the next decade. The question isn't whether we acquire it, but how quickly we can make it legally ours. Marcus activated a tablet, displaying code fragments that made Zara's heart race. They were her algorithms stolen, partially decoded, and presented as discovered research. Seeing her life's work twisted into evidence for their theft felt like watching someone auction pieces of her soul. This represents maybe 20% of the complete system, Marcus explained. But even this fragment demonstrates unprecedented capability. Natural language processing beyond anything currently available. Machine learning algorithms that adapt in real time and integration protocols that could revolutionize human-computer interaction. Sarah leaned forward, dollar signs practically visible in her eyes. What's our acquisition timeline? That's where things get complicated, admitted one of the patent attorneys. The original researcher has been incredibly careful about anonymity. We can't identify them to negotiate directly, and reverse engineering raises obvious legal concerns. Legal concerns are obstacles, not barriers, David replied coldly. We need this technology, and we need it now. Our stock price can't survive another quarter of disappointing results. What followed was a detailed discussion of corporate theft disguised as aggressive business strategy. They planned to reverse engineer her algorithms, file patents on derivative works, then claim ownership through legal precedents. Any challenges would be met with litigation designed to bankrupt individual researchers who couldn't afford extended court battles. The casual cruelty of it was stunning. They weren't just stealing her work, they were systematically destroying the legal protections designed to help independent innovators. Future researchers would find themselves defenseless against corporate predators with unlimited legal budgets. But tonight, the predators had chosen the wrong prey. Zara continued serving wine and clearing plates while recording every word of their conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming: detailed plans for patent fraud, intellectual property theft, and systematic corruption of oversight agencies. By the end of the evening, she'd have enough material to destroy Technova and send its leadership to federal prison for decades. But prison was too simple. These people had built careers on exploiting others' innovations while contributing nothing original themselves. They deserved a punishment that fit their crimes perfectly. As the evening progressed, their confidence grew along with their wine consumption. They began discussing specific implementation timelines, resource allocation, and market penetration strategies. They were planning to build an empire on her stolen work, then take credit for innovations they could never have created themselves. The beauty of this approach, Sarah noted with predatory satisfaction, is that individual researchers have no recourse against corporate patent claims. Even if the original creator surfaces, we'll own the legal rights to any commercial applications. Exactly, David agreed. Innovation belongs to whoever can monetize it effectively, not whoever creates it in some basement laboratory. The insult stung because it contained a grain of truth. She had created revolutionary technology in her modest apartment, working alone while they commanded resources she could barely imagine. But they'd made a fatal error in assuming that individual creators were powerless against corporate machines. Tonight would prove them catastrophically wrong. As dinner wound down, Zara prepared for the evening's climactic moment. She'd gathered enough evidence to expose their conspiracy completely, but exposure alone wouldn't satisfy the scope of their crimes. They needed to understand exactly who they'd tried to rob and what that robbery would cost them. Gentlemen, before you finish planning your federal crimes, I have something that will shatter your world, she said, approaching David directly for the first time all evening. David looked up with mild annoyance. We're conducting private business here. I understand completely, but I think you'll want to see this. Zara pulled out her phone and played a brief audio clip, David's own voice describing their plans for patent fraud and intellectual property theft. The table fell silent as the implications hit them. You've been recording us, Marcus said, his engineering brain processing the catastrophe first. They'd been caught red-handed by their victim. For the past 2 evenings, yes. Every word, every admission, every detail of your conspiracy to commit federal crimes. The color drained from David's face. You can't, that's illegal recording without consent. Zara smiled for the first time all evening, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Actually, New York is a one-party consent state for recordings. As long as one participant knows about the recording, in this case, me, it's completely legal. But that's not the most interesting part. She pulled out a tablet and displayed her complete AI algorithm, the very technology they'd been planning to steal, shown in its full, undiluted glory. You see, gentlemen, you've been trying to steal technology from someone who's been serving your wine all evening. Meet Dr. Zara Johnson, the Harvard PhD, creator of the algorithms you just planned to steal, and the woman you rejected for not being a good cultural fit. The silence crashed over them like a tsunami of realization. His world collapsed into 2 words from David's mouth. You're nobody. I'm a nobody because you rejected my job application 6 months ago, claiming I wasn't a good cultural fit for your dynamic team environment. Apparently, Harvard PhDs don't count if they come in the wrong packaging. The recognition finally dawned in David's eyes, the application he'd dismissed, the candidate he'd judged unworthy of consideration. His expression shifted from confusion to horror as the full scope of his mistake became clear. You have 2 choices, Zara continued with deadly calm. Option 1, I take these recordings to the FBI tomorrow morning. Patent fraud, conspiracy to commit theft of intellectual property, and corruption of federal oversight officials should be good for 20 to 30 years in federal prison. What's option 2? Sarah asked, her venture capitalist instincts still functioning despite the shock. Zara's smile widened, becoming genuinely predatory. Option 2 lets you keep breathing in the corporate world. You see, you still need my technology to save your failing company. And despite everything, I'm willing to make a deal. David found his voice again. What kind of deal? A licensing agreement. You get legal access to my algorithms. Technova gets the technology it desperately needs, and I get fair compensation for my work. Plus some additional considerations for the inconvenience you've caused. What additional considerations? Marcus asked carefully. Zara pulled out a prepared contract, placing it on the table with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. 60% revenue sharing on all products incorporating my technology. A $50 million innovation fund for underrepresented researchers. And complete restructuring of Technova's hiring practices to eliminate the cultural bias that created this situation. The terms were deliberately harsh, designed to hurt but not destroy. They'd still profit from her innovation, but they'd pay a price that reflected the true cost of their prejudice and criminality. David's voice cracked like a teenager's. This is extortion. This is justice, Zara corrected. You tried to steal my life's work because you didn't think I was worthy of fair consideration. Now you can have legal access to that work, but you'll pay market rates plus penalties for your attempted theft. She gestured to the tablet containing her algorithms. This technology could be worth billions in the right hands. I'm offering you those hands, legally and ethically. But if you prefer federal prison to fair business practices, I'm happy to accommodate that choice. The corporate conspirators exchanged glances, their empire of stolen innovation crumbling around them. They'd been outmaneuvered by someone they'd dismissed as irrelevant, trapped by their own arrogance and prejudice. We'll need time to consider, Sarah said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, Zara replied. After that, my next conversation will be with federal prosecutors. She collected her tablet and phone, leaving the contract on the table like a grenade with the pin pulled. Oh, and David, next time you reject someone for not being a cultural fit, you might want to make sure they're not smarter than your entire executive team combined. Walking away from table 7, Zara felt the intoxicating rush of perfect revenge. They'd dismissed her because of their prejudices, tried to steal her work because of their arrogance, and now faced destruction because of their crimes. But she was offering them something more valuable than revenge. The chance at redemption, whether they were smart enough to take it, remained to be seen. David Morrison's sleepless night stretched like an eternity of reckoning. He sat in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, staring at the contract that held his fate hostage while his empire's death replayed in endless loop. The irony strangled him slowly, each breath a reminder of his cosmic stupidity. For 6 months, Technova had hemorrhaged money while desperately searching for breakthrough technology. They'd orchestrated a criminal symphony, only to discover their victim was conducting the orchestra. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from board members, investors, and legal counsel. Word of the evening's debacle had spread through Manhattan's elite circles with the speed of financial panic. Sarah Williams had already leaked selective details to minimize her own exposure, painting David as a rogue CEO operating without board oversight. Marcus Chen knocked on the office door at 3 a.m., looking haggard and defeated. "The legal apocalypse has arrived in a manila folder," he said, dropping a thick folder on David's desk. "We're dead men walking." David opened the folder with trembling hands. Technova's legal team had worked through the night analyzing their exposure, and the results were devastating. Patent fraud would cage them like animals for decades in federal concrete. Conspiracy to commit intellectual property theft could result in decades in federal prison. The corruption charges involving government officials elevated everything to RIK prosecution levels. "How bad?" David asked, though his expression already knew the answer. "If she goes to the FBI, we're looking at 20 to 30 years minimum. The company gets dissolved, assets seized, and everyone involved becomes unemployable in tech forever." Marcus slumped into a chair, his brilliant mind finally grasping the full scope of their stupidity. "We tried to pickpocket Einstein while she was solving relativity." The contract Zara had proposed suddenly looked like salvation, rather than extortion. 60% revenue sharing was harsh but survivable. A $50 million innovation fund would hurt but wouldn't destroy them. Restructuring hiring practices was actually good business. Diverse teams consistently outperformed homogeneous ones. "There's something else," Marcus continued reluctantly. "I spent the night analyzing her algorithms. They're not just revolutionary, they're perfect. Clean code, elegant architecture, scalable design. This isn't just breakthrough technology. It's the future of artificial intelligence." David stared out at the city lights, calculating odds and outcomes. His ego screamed for war, while his survival instincts whispered surrender. But reality crushed pride like an avalanche buries a snowflake. Zara held all the cards, and she was offering him a way to survive his own arrogance. "What's your recommendation?" he asked, finally. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Take the deal. We get access to technology worth billions, we avoid federal prison, and we still maintain majority ownership of our company. Plus, if we're smart about implementation, 60% of revolutionary profits is still more money than we've ever seen." The decision should have been easy, but David's ego warred with his survival instincts. He'd built his identity around being the smartest person in every room, the visionary leader who spotted opportunities others missed. Admitting that a waitress had outmaneuvered him completely felt like professional suicide. But actual suicide, the destruction of everything he'd built, was the alternative. At dawn, David dialed his corporate funeral director. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been expecting his surrender. "Mr. Morrison," she said with professional courtesy that somehow managed to sound condescending. "I trust you've had time to consider my proposal." David swallowed his pride like broken glass. "We accept your terms. When can we finalize the agreement?" "This afternoon. I've already prepared the complete documentation. We'll meet at my lawyer's office. Neutral ground for both parties." Her surgical efficiency dissected his ego with clinical precision. While he'd spent the night agonizing over his decision, she'd choreographed his surrender like a master puppeteer. She'd anticipated his every move, planned for his every response, and positioned herself for total victory. "There's one additional condition," Zara continued. "The agreement includes a public announcement of our partnership, including the circumstances that led to this arrangement." Technova will publicly acknowledge that your previous hiring practices excluded qualified candidates due to unconscious bias. The public execution of his reputation would be broadcast in 4K clarity, but David no longer had the luxury of pride. Agreed. Excellent. See you at 2 p.m. The line went dead, leaving David alone with the wreckage of his assumptions about merit, worth, and who deserved to succeed in Silicon Valley. The afternoon meeting took place in a conference room that felt like a courtroom. Zara arrived with a legal team that included Harvard classmates now practicing intellectual property law at elite firms. David brought Technova's entire legal department, but their expertise in corporate bullying meant nothing against opponents who understood both technology and justice. The contract signing felt like signing his own corporate death warrant in golden ink. Every clause was a steel trap disguised as legal language, crafted to protect Zara's interests while limiting Technova's ability to exploit or undermine their partnership. David found himself agreeing to terms he would never have accepted from an equal, but Zara had never been his equal. She was his superior in every way that mattered. One final detail, Zara said as documents were being notarized. The Innovation Fund will be administered by a board I select, focusing on researchers from underrepresented communities. No Technova oversight, no corporate influence on grant decisions. Sarah Williams, attending as a board representative, finally spoke up. You're demanding we fund our own ethical education with $50 million. Zara's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Consider it tuition for Harvard's advanced course in how not to be corporate sociopaths. The contracts were signed in silence, broken only by the scratch of pens and the rustle of legal documents. With each signature, David felt pieces of his old identity crumbling away. The man who had dismissed Zara as culturally unfit was legally binding himself to serve her vision of what Technova could become. But as humiliating as the process felt, David couldn't ignore the underlying reality. He was gaining access to technology that would revolutionize his industry. If he could swallow his pride and learn from his mistakes, this partnership might salvage both his company and his career. The public announcement 3 days later sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley. Technova's press release acknowledged previous shortcomings in our hiring practices that prevented us from recognizing exceptional talent and announced a transformative partnership with Dr. Zara Johnson, whose innovative AI technology will drive our future growth. The tech press dissected every word, reading between lines and speculating about the real story behind Technova's sudden transformation. Industry insiders whispered about David's fall from grace, while diversity advocates celebrated what appeared to be a genuine commitment to inclusive practices. Zara's first day at Technova as Chief Technology Officer was orchestrated like a military campaign. She arrived early, dressed in the same Harvard Business School attire that had failed to impress David 6 months earlier. But now her presence commanded respect that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the algorithms that could save or destroy the company. "Good morning," she said to the engineering team David had assembled for her introduction. "I'm here to show you the future of artificial intelligence, but more importantly, I'm here to change how this company thinks about talent, innovation, and who deserves a seat at the table." The engineers, mostly young, mostly male, mostly from identical educational backgrounds, stared at her with mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. They'd heard about her technology but couldn't reconcile the brilliant algorithms with the woman who'd been serving drinks in a restaurant. "Let me address the obvious question," Zara continued. "Yes, I was working as a waitress when Mr. Morrison tried to steal my intellectual property. Not because I lacked qualifications, but because this company's hiring practices systematically excluded people who didn't fit a narrow cultural profile." She activated the main display screen, showing code that made the engineers lean forward in their chairs. The algorithms were elegant beyond anything they'd seen, solving problems they'd struggled with for years. "This is what you almost lost because of unconscious bias," Zara said. "This is what happens when you judge people by their packaging instead of their potential. And this is why Technova is going to become a very different kind of company." Over the following weeks, Zara implemented changes that transformed Technova's culture as dramatically as her technology transformed their products. Hiring practices were restructured to eliminate bias through blind resume reviews and skills-based assessments. The engineering team diversified rapidly as qualified candidates who'd been previously overlooked finally received fair consideration. The results were immediate and remarkable. Diverse teams solved problems faster, identified market opportunities sooner, and created innovations that homogeneous groups had missed entirely. Technova's stock price began recovering as investors recognized the company's genuine transformation. But David clawed his way toward redemption like a drowning man reaching for a life preserver Zara had thrown him. Learning to work with someone who'd outmaneuvered him so completely required a fundamental reassessment of his assumptions about leadership, merit, and worth. "I owe you an apology," he said, during one of their weekly strategy meetings. "Not just for the rejection letter, but for everything that rejection represented. I made assumptions about who could contribute value to this company, and those assumptions were not only wrong but destructive." Zara studied him with the analytical precision she applied to code optimization. "Apologies are appreciated, but actions matter more. The question is whether you can learn from this experience, or whether you'll revert to old patterns once the immediate crisis passes." It was a fair challenge, and David found himself working harder than ever to prove he could change. He attended diversity training sessions, participated in unconscious bias workshops, and gradually learned to recognize the privilege that had shaped his entire worldview. The transformation wasn't easy or comfortable, but it was necessary. Technova's success now depended on Zara's technology and vision, which meant David's success depended on becoming the kind of leader who could support and amplify diverse talent rather than just recognizing familiar patterns. 6 months after the contract signing, Technova announced its first product incorporating Zara's AI technology. The natural language processing system exceeded every performance benchmark, generating a pre-order tsunami that swept away David's last doubts about paying Zara's price. Suddenly, 60% revenue sharing didn't feel like extortion, it felt like the bargain of the century. David's voice cracked with genuine gratitude. "You could have buried us alive, but chose resurrection instead. Why offer partnership instead of revenge?" Zara considered the question while watching Technova employees, now notably more diverse and innovative, celebrate their success, because destruction is easy, but transformation is valuable. "I wanted to prove that diversity isn't just morally right, it's strategically superior. Your old hiring practices weren't just unfair, they were bad business that limited your access to the best talent." The launch party marked the end of David's old identity and the beginning of something unprecedented. A Silicon Valley success story built on inclusion rather than exclusion, justice rather than exploitation. But Zara's ultimate vision extended far beyond Technova's transformation. She was building something much larger, much more ambitious, and much more revolutionary than a single company's redemption. 2 years after David Morrison's corporate execution, Zara commanded the Silicon Valley Innovation Summit stage like a conquering queen, addressing the same predators who once dismissed her, now hanging on her every syllable like gospel truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had fundamentally changed the rules of the game. 2 years ago, I was invisible furniture serving champagne to thieves plotting to rob my life's work. Today, I'm detonating the launch of Nexus AI NEAS, a billion-dollar bomb that will obliterate everything Silicon Valley thinks it knows about success." The audience erupted in applause, but Zara wasn't finished dismantling conventional wisdom. "Nexus AI has achieved something unprecedented in our industry. A billion-dollar valuation built entirely by teams from underrepresented communities. No nepotism, no insider networks, no cultural fit requirements, just pure talent, fairly evaluated and properly compensated." From his seat in the front row, David Morrison sat like a reformed sinner watching his savior preach revolution. Pride wrestled with shame, while admiration strangled his ego, watching his former victim reshape the world he'd once ruled. The innovation fund established through our Technova partnership has now supported over 300 researchers from underrepresented communities, Zara continued. Their brilliance has spawned 17 revolutionary patents and birthed 43 startup unicorns from the ashes of exclusion. Sarah Williams, now serving on Nexus AI's advisory board, nodded with the enthusiasm of someone who had learned to profit from justice rather than exploitation. Her venture capital firm had restructured completely, focusing on diverse founders and ethical business practices. The financial returns had exceeded her most optimistic projections. But individual victories are just battle scars. We need total war against systemic bias, Zara said, her tone shifting to something more serious and urgent. We need to vaccinate the industry against the virus of unconscious bias that nearly killed innovation itself. The reference to David by name drew murmurs from the audience. But David himself had learned to accept such moments as necessary reminders of his transformation journey. He'd become living proof that even the most privileged and prejudiced leaders could learn, change, and contribute to more equitable systems. Today, I'm unleashing the Nexus Initiative, a systematic extermination of bias that will hunt down prejudice like a predator stalks prey. Participating companies will implement blind resume reviews, skills-based assessments, and diverse interview panels. In return, they'll gain access to talent pools they've never tapped and innovation potential they've never imagined. Marcus Chen, now Technova's CEO after David's voluntary transition to chairman, stood and began applauding. Within seconds, the entire audience joined him in recognition of what Zara was proposing, nothing less than the complete restructuring of how Silicon Valley identified and developed talent. The companies that embrace this revolution will feast on the corpses of those who cling to bias, Zara predicted with the certainty of someone who had already proven the hypothesis. Those that cling to old biases and exclusionary practices will find themselves obsolete, replaced by competitors who understand that diversity isn't just morally superior, it's strategically essential. Following her presentation, Zara found herself surrounded by executives eager to join the Nexus Initiative. The same leaders who might have dismissed her 2 years ago now competed for her attention, recognizing that she represented the future they needed to embrace or be destroyed by. David approached like a penitent approaching an altar, uncertain if his sins had been forgiven. "Remarkable presentation," he said. "You've managed to make ethical practices sound like competitive advantages." "Because they are," Zara replied simply. "Your old Technova was dying because homogeneous thinking produces predictable solutions. Our new Technova thrives because diverse perspectives generate breakthrough innovations. The market rewards results, not prejudices." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar face, Dr. Angela Rodriguez, one of the first recipients of the Technova Innovation Fund. Her research in quantum computing applications had revolutionized cybersecurity, earning her recognition as one of TechReview's innovators under 35. "Dr. Johnson, you literally resurrected my career from its corporate grave," Angela said with genuine warmth. 2 years ago, I was about to leave research entirely because no one would fund my work. Now I'm launching my third startup with backing from every major venture capital firm in the Valley. These encounters repeated throughout the evening. Researchers, entrepreneurs, and innovators whose careers had been rescued or launched by Zara's systematic dismantling of Silicon Valley's exclusionary practices. Each success story represented not just individual triumph, but proof that the industry had been systematically wasting enormous amounts of human potential. Later that evening, at the summit's closing reception, Zara found herself in conversation with Dr. Jennifer Park, a Stanford professor studying the economic impact of diversity initiatives in technology companies. "Your natural experiment with Technova has provided fascinating data," Dr. Park noted. "Companies embracing our principles are devouring their biased competitors like sharks in bloody water." "The data shouldn't be surprising," Zara replied. "When you stop excluding 70% of the talent pool based on irrelevant criteria, of course you find better candidates. The real mystery is why it took so long for anyone to test these assumptions scientifically." The reception's highlight came when David Morrison approached the microphone for an unscheduled address. The audience quieted, uncertain what to expect from the man whose transformation had become Silicon Valley legend. 2 years ago, I committed professional suicide by rejecting the woman who would reshape our entire industry. David began, his voice steady but humble. That decision nearly destroyed my company and should have ended my career. The silence was profound as David continued his public reckoning with his own prejudices. But Dr. Johnson offered me something more valuable than revenge. She offered me education. She performed open-heart surgery on my biases, replacing my prejudices with principles that actually create value. Technova's success over the past 2 years proves that diversity isn't charity. It's competitive advantage. He paused, gathering courage for his final admission. I stand before you tonight as living proof that even the most privileged and prejudiced among us can learn, change, and contribute to more equitable systems. But change requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how our industry really works, and committing to systematic reforms rather than cosmetic adjustments. The applause erupted like a dam bursting, releasing years of suppressed recognition that change wasn't just needed, it was inevitable. David had done something unprecedented in their industry. He'd publicly acknowledged his failures and credited someone else with his education. As the evening wound down, Zara stepped onto the reception hall's balcony overlooking the lights of San Francisco Bay. The city sprawled below like a neural network, firing with the electricity of revolution she had sparked. Marcus joined her in the comfortable silence, both contemplating how much had changed since that night at the Sterling restaurant. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if David hadn't been stupid enough to reject genius when it knocked on his door? Marcus asked. Zara considered the question seriously. I'd have been an excellent employee, made significant contributions, and probably earned a comfortable living. But I wouldn't have transformed an entire industry's hiring practices or launched companies that have created thousands of opportunities for underrepresented researchers. So his rejection was actually a gift? His rejection was rocket fuel. It launched me beyond his comprehension into a different orbit entirely. Zara corrected. It forced me to see the systemic problems rather than just my individual circumstances. Sometimes the greatest innovations come from people who've been excluded from traditional systems. We have nothing to lose by challenging conventional wisdom. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah Williams, who approached with barely contained excitement. Zara, I need to share some preliminary numbers from our portfolio analysis. Companies embracing our principles are devouring their biased competitors like sharks in bloody water. We're looking at a complete paradigm shift. The implications were staggering. If diverse, inclusive companies consistently outperformed homogeneous ones, market forces would eventually compel widespread adoption of equitable practices. Justice and profit were aligning in ways that would make systematic change inevitable rather than optional. There's something else, Sarah continued. We've had inquiries from international markets, European firms, Asian corporations, even government agencies wanting to implement similar programs. This isn't just transforming Silicon Valley anymore, it's going global. As the reception ended and guests began departing, Zara found herself alone with David for the first time since their contract negotiation 2 years earlier. The dynamic between them had evolved from adversarial to collaborative, but underlying tensions remained. I need to ask you something, David said carefully. When you offered me that partnership instead of destroying me completely, was it mercy or strategy? Zara smiled with the same analytical precision she'd displayed that night at the Sterling. It was recognition that people can change if given proper incentives. You weren't evil, just ignorant and privileged. Destroying you would have been satisfying but pointless. Transforming you created a powerful example for others. And if I hadn't changed, if I'd reverted to old patterns, then you would have discovered that the contract included termination clauses that would have transferred all Technova assets to the Innovation Fund. Zara replied matter-of-factly. I planned for every contingency, including the possibility that your transformation might be temporary performance rather than genuine change. David laughed despite himself, recognizing once again how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated completely. You know, he said, I think I finally understand what you meant about cultural fit. I wasn't looking for people who would strengthen our culture. I was looking for people who would reinforce my existing prejudices. Exactly. True cultural fit means finding people who share your values and complement your weaknesses, not people who look and think exactly like you. Their conversation was interrupted by Angela Rodriguez, now accompanied by two other Nexus Initiative grant recipients. Dr. Michael Thompson, whose work in renewable energy storage had revolutionized solar power efficiency, and Dr. Lisa Chen, whose medical AI research was transforming diagnostic accuracy in underserved communities. Dr. Johnson, Angela said, "We wanted you to know that we're launching a collaborative research initiative, pooling our expertise to tackle climate change, healthcare access, and educational equity simultaneously." The announcement represented everything Zara had envisioned when she first conceived the Innovation Fund, brilliant minds from diverse backgrounds, collaborating on humanity's greatest challenges, supported by resources that had once been hoarded by homogeneous elite networks. "That's exactly what the industry needs," Zara replied. "Systematic collaboration rather than individual competition. When diverse talents work together on shared goals, the results exceed anything any single group could achieve alone." As the evening finally concluded, Zara drove through the empty streets of Silicon Valley, reflecting on the journey from that devastating rejection email to this moment of industry-wide transformation. The woman who had been deemed culturally unfit now shaped the culture of the entire technology sector, but her ultimate goal remained unfinished. Changing Silicon Valley was just the beginning of a larger mission to ensure that talent and innovation could flourish regardless of background, connections, or traditional markers of belonging. The next morning brought news that validated everything Zara had worked toward. The European Union announced adoption of Nexus Initiative principles for all technology sector hiring within member nations. The Asian Development Bank committed to funding similar programs across developing economies. Even the United States Congress was considering legislation requiring diversity metrics for federal technology contractors. What had begun as one woman's response to employment discrimination had become a global movement reshaping how entire societies identified and developed human potential. Standing in her office at Nexus AI headquarters, surrounded by teams of brilliant researchers from every conceivable background, Zara felt the satisfaction of having transformed injustice into systematic change. The rejection intended to bury her alive had instead planted the seeds of an empire that would reshape human potential itself. The intercom buzzed with her assistant's voice. "Dr. Johnson, Harvard Business School is requesting a case study interview about your transformation of industry hiring practices. They want to include your story in their required curriculum for all MBA students." Zara smiled at the irony. The same institutions that had initially excluded her now wanted to study her methods for inclusion. But that was exactly how systematic change worked, making equitable practices so obviously superior that adoption became inevitable rather than optional. "Schedule the interview," she replied. "It's time to ensure that future business leaders understand the true cost of exclusion and the competitive advantages of inclusion." The revolution was complete, but the work of building more equitable systems would continue for generations. Zara had proven that individual brilliance, combined with systematic thinking and strategic patience, could transform entire industries. More importantly, she demonstrated that justice and profit could align when visionary leaders had the courage to challenge conventional wisdom and the persistence to implement better alternatives. The woman they'd branded culturally unfit now authored the cultural revolution that would make their grandchildren wonder how bias had ever seemed acceptable.